German townspeople couldn't believe Americans built schools after bombings. April 12, 1945. The town of Bad Kreuznach, nestled in the Rhine Valley of southwestern Germany. Morning fog still clings to the rubble-choked streets like a mourning veil. The air tastes of plastered dust and charred timber. In the skeletal remains of what was once the Kausenberg district, an old woman stands motionless, watching American soldiers unload crates from a convoy of trucks. She has not left this spot for 3 hours. Her hands, weathered and trembling, clutch a piece of brick, all that remains of the schoolhouse where her granddaughter once learned arithmetic. The trucks are olive green, spotless despite the mud-caked roads. The crates are stamped with white stenciled letters, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Inside them are not bullets, not barbed wire, not the instruments of occupation that 5 years of Nazi propaganda promised would follow an Allied victory. Inside are wooden beams, bags of cement, coils of copper wire, glass panes wrapped in burlap, and boxes of nails. The soldiers, boys really, most no older than 22, work with a mechanical efficiency born not of cruelty but of purpose. They are building something. In a town they bombed 6 weeks prior, they are building a school. The old woman does not understand. She cannot. For 12 years she has been told that Americans are gangsters and mongrels, that their civilization is hollow, that their wealth is theft, that their democracy is a mask for Jewish manipulation. She has been told that if they ever came to German soil, they would burn, loot, and defile. Yet here they are, sweating under an April sun, laying foundations where her neighbors once buried their dead. She watches one of the soldiers, a tall black man with a Carolina drawl, carry a sack of cement on his shoulder, joking with a shorter man whose helmet sits crooked on his head. They are laughing. She has not heard laughter in this street since 1943. By nightfall, the frame of a single-room schoolhouse stands where the Kausenberg primary school once crumbled. It is crude, temporary, built from salvaged bricks and American lumber. But it stands. And in the dying light of that April evening, children begin to gather, tentatively, silently. Their faces smudged, very young can hold without breaking. One boy, no older than 7, approaches the nearest soldier and asks in halting German, "Warum?" Why? The soldier does not speak German. But he smiles, crouches down, and from his pack produces a Hershey bar. He hands it to the boy. The boy stares at it as if it were a relic from another world. In a sense, it is. This moment, this incomprehensible gesture of reconstruction in the shadow of destruction, would be repeated in hundreds of German towns across the American occupation zone in the spring and summer of 1945. It was not an anomaly. It was policy, and it shattered something deeper than walls and windows. It shattered belief itself. To understand why the sight of Americans building schools in bombed German towns seemed so impossible, so surreal, one must first understand what the German people had been taught to expect. From the moment the Allies began their relentless bombing campaigns in 1942, Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Propaganda had prepared the German public for one inevitable outcome: total annihilation at the hands of a vindictive, racially inferior enemy. The message was clear and constant. If Germany lost, there would be no mercy. The Americans, corrupted by their melting pot society and controlled by international Jewry, would not come as liberators. They would come as exterminators. Goebbels' speeches in the final years of the war grew increasingly apocalyptic. In February 1945, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and American bombers turned German cities into moonscapes, he declared, "Behind the oncoming Soviet divisions, we see the Jewish liquidation commandos, and behind them terror, the specter of mass starvation and complete anarchy." The implication was unmistakable. Surrender meant extinction. The propaganda posters plastered on the ruins of Frankfurt, Cologne, and Mannheim depicted American soldiers as grinning devils, torches in hand, standing over the corpses of German women and children. One widely circulated image showed a caricatured Jewish banker directing a black American soldier to bayonet a blonde child. The caption read, "Das ist die Freiheit, die sie bringen." This is the freedom they bring. For 5 years, this narrative had been gospel. And in the apocalyptic winter of 1944-45, as cities burned and the Wehrmacht disintegrated, millions of Germans believed it. They believed that when the Americans arrived, there would be firing squads, mass deportations, starvation, the systematic erasure of German identity. They did not expect lumber. They did not expect cement. They certainly did not expect chocolate bars handed to children in the rubble. Yet that is precisely what arrived. The American occupation policy that emerged in 1945 was not born of sentimentality. It was born of pragmatism, shaped by men who remembered the aftermath of the First World War and understood that vengeance breeds only more war. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed Germany economically and politically, leaving a vacuum that Adolf Hitler filled with rage and nationalist fervor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, even before his death in April 1945, and his successor Harry S. Truman understood that a second Versailles would be a catastrophic mistake. The goal was not to destroy Germany, but to transform it, to replace the machinery of fascism with the machinery of democracy, and to do so not through terror, but through demonstration. This philosophy was formalized in Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, issued in April 1945, which outlined American policy in occupied Germany. Though initially punitive in tone, emphasizing denazification and the dismantling of German war industries, it left space for reconstruction efforts aimed at stabilizing civilian life. More importantly, on the ground, American commanders exercised a degree of autonomy that allowed for humane improvisation. Generals like Lucius D. Clay, who would become the military governor of the U.S. zone, believed that starving and brutalizing the German population would only sow the seeds of future conflict. Instead, they advocated for what Clay called constructive occupation, an approach that balanced justice with mercy, accountability with rebuilding. The soldiers who arrived in towns like Bad Kreuznach, Wurzburg, Pforzheim, and Heilbronn were not told to be kind. They were told to restore order, prevent disease, and establish functional civil administration. But in the process, something unexpected happened. They saw the children. They saw the old men and women picking through rubble for scraps of food. They saw the hollow eyes of people who had been lied to for so long that truth itself seemed unrecognizable. And many of them, raised in towns across Kansas, Ohio, Texas, and California, where neighbors helped neighbors rebuild after fires and floods, responded not with cruelty but with carpentry. By June 1945, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had established reconstruction units tasked with clearing rubble, restoring water and electrical systems, and rebuilding essential infrastructure. Schools were among the top priorities. The reasoning was both practical and ideological. Practical, because children needed to be off the streets, where unexploded ordnance and collapsing buildings posed constant danger. Ideological, because education was seen as the primary weapon against fascism. A generation raised in Nazi ideology could not be left to fester in ignorance and resentment. They had to be taught a different way. So the Americans built. In Aachen, the first major German city captured by U.S. forces in October 1944, military engineers repaired the roof of the Domsingschule by January 1945, even as fighting raged 30 miles to the east. In Cologne, where 90% of the city center had been obliterated, American soldiers cleared the ruins of the St. Agnes School and erected a temporary wooden structure so classes could resume by May. In Munich, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart, similar efforts unfolded. Often these schools were little more than patched-together shells, drafty, cold, furnished with salvaged desks and donated chalkboards, but they functioned. Children returned. Lessons resumed, and the German people watched bewildered. Frau Margaret Hals was 43 years old when the Americans arrived in Heilbronn on April 12, 1945. She had been a schoolteacher before the war, but the school where she taught, the Murachstrasse Volksschule, had been destroyed in a British bombing raid on December 4, 1944. That night, Heilbronn burned. Over 6,500 people died. The city center ceased to exist. Margaret survived in a cellar with 17 others, listening to the roar of incendiary bombs and the screams of those who did not make it underground. When she emerged the next morning, the world she knew was gone. For 4 months, she lived in a makeshift refugee camp on the outskirts of the city. There was no school, no work, no future. The Nazi officials who had once strutted through Heilbronn streets vanished. The Wehrmacht soldiers retreated. Then, in mid-April, the Americans came. Margaret expected arrest. She was a teacher. She had taught Nazi curriculum. She had led her students in singing the Horstwessel Lied. She had told them that the Führer was Germany's savior. She expected punishment. Instead, she was offered a job. In late May 1945, an American officer, a captain from the military government detachment, visited the refugee camp. He was looking for teachers. Not Nazi party members, he clarified, but teachers who could help restart the education system. Margaret hesitated. She admitted her past, expecting immediate dismissal. The captain listened, nodded, and asked a single question. "Do you believe in what you taught?" She paused. Then quietly she said no. She had believed once, she admitted, but not anymore. Not after the camps. Not after the revelations that were beginning to surface about Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Not after the lies became undeniable. The captain hired her. By June 1945, Margaret was teaching again, in a repaired wing of the old Murachstrasse school, under American supervision. The curriculum was new, stripped of Nazi ideology. The textbooks were provided by the U.S. military government, printed in German but written with American ideals of civic responsibility, critical thinking, and tolerance. The children were wary at first. So was she. But Margaret did not have all the answers. But for the first time in 12 years, she was allowed to admit that. Years later, in a letter to a former colleague, Margaret wrote, "I do not think the Americans understood what they gave us when they rebuilt that school. It was not just walls and desks. It was permission to doubt, to question, to begin again." The German expectation of annihilation was not irrational. It was rooted in the German experience of war. In the East, the Red Army had swept through Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia with a brutality born of 4 years of genocidal Nazi warfare on Soviet soil. Reports of mass rape, executions, and deportations filtered westward, confirming the worst fears stoked by Nazi propaganda. In contrast, the Western Allies, British, Canadian, and American, were comparatively restrained. But restraint, to a population conditioned to expect total war and total retribution, felt like an impossibility. So when the Americans arrived and began not with gallows and mass arrests, but with tractors clearing rubble and engineers surveying foundations for schools, hospitals, and waterworks, the cognitive dissonance was profound. It manifested in silence, in stares, in disbelief that slowly, hesitantly, gave way to something more dangerous to the Nazi worldview than any bomb: hope. The rebuilding of schools became symbolic of a larger truth that the German people were being forced to confront. The Americans were not the monsters they had been promised. They were not vengeful. They were not weak, either. They had crushed the Wehrmacht with overwhelming industrial might, but their strength was not expressed in cruelty. It was expressed in construction, in organization, in a kind of abundance that seemed almost obscene to a population that had been rationed and starved for 5 years. Consider the food. In May 1945, the average German civilian in the American zone was surviving on approximately 1,000 calories per day, well below subsistence level. Malnutrition was rampant. Children suffered with it, the distribution networks that had kept the population fed, however, inadequately. Starvation loomed. The Americans, though under no obligation to feed the German population beyond the minimum necessary to prevent epidemics, began emergency food distribution almost immediately. By July 1945, U.S. military kitchens were feeding over 2 million German civilians daily. The rations were basic: bread, potatoes, canned vegetables, powdered milk, but they were consistent. More importantly, they were free. To the Germans, accustomed to a war economy where every crumb was accounted for and distributed according to racial hierarchy, this abundance was incomprehensible. Where did it come from? How could an army fighting a war on 2 continents, supplying millions of soldiers, also feed its defeated enemies? The answer lay in the sheer productive capacity of the American economy, a capacity that had been invisible to the German people, obscured by propaganda that portrayed America as a decadent, fractured nation incapable of sustained effort. The schoolchildren who returned to those rebuilt classrooms in the summer of 1945 often found, alongside their new textbooks, something else: a meal. The Americans instituted school lunch programs as part of their Reconstruction efforts. Hot soup, bread, sometimes, if supplies allowed, fruit, apples or oranges, luxuries most German children had not seen in years. These lunches were not charity, they were strategy. A well-fed child could learn. A starving child could only obsess over hunger. But to the children, and to their parents, it felt like charity. It felt like grace. And it raised a question that gnawed at the edges of Nazi ideology until that ideology crumbled entirely. If the Americans are the enemy, why are they feeding our children? Herr Klaus Dietrich was 16 years old when the war ended. He had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia of old men and boys that Hitler threw at the advancing Allies in a final spasm of futility. Klaus never fired a shot. His unit surrendered to American forces outside Bamberg on April 14, 1945. He was disarmed, interrogated briefly, no punishment, no retribution, just a weary American sergeant who told him, in broken German, to go home. Klaus had no home. His family's apartment in Bamberg had been destroyed in a bombing raid. His father was dead, killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. His mother had fled east, and he did not know if she was alive. So Klaus wandered. He slept in basements and barns. He stole food when he could find it. He was one of millions of displaced young Germans in the chaotic spring of 1945, adrift in a country that had ceased to function. In June, he heard that a school in Bamberg was reopening, and that they were offering meals to any young person willing to attend classes. Klaus had no interest in school. He had been taught to worship Hitler, to die for the fatherland, and all of it had proven to be a lie. But he was hungry, so he went. The school was a repurposed warehouse, its walls still scarred by shrapnel. The desks were mismatched, the windows covered with old paper. But there was a teacher, a German woman, supervised by an American education officer, and there was soup. Klaus attended. At first he was sullen, silent, hostile. The lessons were strange. They talked about democracy, about the rule of law, about individual rights. Concepts that had been demonized under the Nazis as weak, as un-German. Klaus didn't care. He ate his soup and left. But he kept coming back, partly for the food, partly because there was nowhere else to go. And slowly, almost against his will, he began to listen. One day in August, the American education officer, a lieutenant from Pennsylvania, brought in a newspaper. It was a special edition, printed by the U.S. military government, detailing the liberation of the concentration camps. There were photographs: Dachau, Buchenwald, piles of corpses, living skeletons in striped uniforms, mass graves. The lieutenant did not editorialize. He simply pinned the photographs to the wall and said, in careful German, "This was done in your name." Klaus stared at the images. He had heard rumors during the war, whispers about camps, about Jews being resettled, but he had never seen proof. Now it was undeniable. He felt sick, ashamed, angry at the Nazis, at himself, at the world. That night he stayed after class. He asked the teacher, "Why are they helping us? After this, why aren't they just killing us all?" The teacher did not have an easy answer. But she said, "Maybe because they believe we can be better than what we were." Klaus did not know if he believed that, but he kept attending, and in time he completed his education. He became a teacher himself, dedicating his life to ensuring that the children he taught would never be fed the lies he had swallowed. Decades later, in an oral history interview, he said, "The Americans gave us something we did not deserve. Not forgiveness, they couldn't forgive what we had done, but a chance to rebuild, to learn, to become something other than what we had been. That school, that soup, that newspaper on the wall, that was the beginning of my understanding of what freedom actually means." The rebuilding of schools in occupied Germany was not universally popular among the American public. Back in the United States, many questioned why resources were being spent on the German population when American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific. Editorial cartoons depicted GIs spoon-feeding German children while American war widows struggled. There was a sentiment, not entirely unjustified, that Germany deserved to suffer. Congressman John Rankin of Mississippi declared on the House floor, "Let them stew in their own juice. They started this war, let them pay for it." Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau had proposed a plan in 1944 to deindustrialize Germany entirely, turning it into an agrarian state incapable of waging future wars. A plan that, if implemented, would have condemned millions to starvation. But wiser voices prevailed. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, General George Marshall, and President Truman himself understood that punitive peace bred only resentment and extremism. Marshall, in particular, war-torn Europe. The logic was simple: stable, prosperous democracies do not start wars. Humiliated, impoverished nations do. The rebuilding of schools was a microcosm of this philosophy. It was an investment not in bricks and mortar but in minds, in futures, in the possibility that a generation raised in the ashes of fascism could be taught to value something different. And it worked. By 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was established, the education system in the Western zones had been fundamentally transformed. Denazification programs, though imperfect, had removed the most compromised teachers and administrators. New curricula emphasized democratic values, critical thinking, and human rights. History textbooks no longer glorified war and conquest, but examined the causes and consequences of the Nazi regime with unflinching honesty. The generation that attended those rebuilt schools would grow up to become the architects of modern Germany, a stable, democratic, and prosperous nation deeply integrated into the Western Alliance. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it purely the result of American benevolence. Many Germans resisted denazification. Many former Nazis slipped back into positions of power. The process was messy, incomplete, and often frustratingly slow. But the fact that it happened at all, that Germany did not descend into vengeful chaos or slide back into authoritarianism, owes much to the decisions made in those early months of occupation, to the soldiers who unloaded lumber instead of bullets, to the engineers who built classrooms instead of prisons, to the officers who understood that the true defeat of fascism required not just the destruction of its armies, but the dismantling of its ideology. There is a photograph, faded now, archived in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It was taken in July 1945 in the town of Schweinfurt, which had been bombed repeatedly throughout the war due to its ball-bearing factories. The photograph shows a group of German children, about 20 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 12, sitting on makeshift benches in a half-ruined building. The roof is gone. The walls are pockmarked with shrapnel. But there is a chalkboard, and on it, Someone has written the date and a simple German sentence. Heut beginnen wir new. Today we begin again. Standing beside the chalkboard is an American soldier. He is young, perhaps 25, with dirt on his uniform and a weary smile. He is not a teacher. He is a combat engineer, trained to build bridges and clear mines. But on this day he is holding a piece of chalk, helping a German teacher restore a classroom. The children in the photograph are not smiling. They look solemn, uncertain, but they are present. They have returned. They are beginning again. This photograph, like thousands of others taken across occupied Germany in 1945, captures something essential about the American character, something that Nazi ideology could never comprehend. It is not sentimentality. It is not weakness. It is a deeply pragmatic belief that people, even former enemies, are capable of change. That hatred, while powerful, is not inevitable. That the tools of destruction can be set aside and the tools of construction picked up. That a child taught to hate can be taught instead to build. The German people, confronted with this reality, experienced a kind of ideological vertigo. For 12 years, they had been told that democracy was a sham, that the West was degenerate, that strength lay only in domination and racial purity. Then the strongest nation on earth arrived on their doorsteps, not with whips and chains, but with tractors and blueprints. Not with starvation, but with soup kitchens. Not with destruction, but with schools. It is one thing to be defeated by a stronger enemy. It is another to be defeated and then shown mercy. Mercy is destabilizing. It cannot be easily categorized or dismissed. It demands a reevaluation of everything one believed. The Germans had expected annihilation and received reconstruction. They had expected cruelty and received, if not kindness, then at least fairness. They had expected the Americans to behave like conquerors and found instead that the Americans behaved like builders. This dissonance manifested in 1,000 small moments. The old woman in Bad Kreuznach, watching the school rise from the rubble. Margaret Halls, offered a teaching position instead of imprisonment. Klaus Dietrich fed soup and handed a newspaper that shattered his world. These moments accumulated. They spread. They became stories told and retold, passed from neighbor to neighbor, parent to child. And in those stories, a new understanding began to take root. The Americans were not the monsters. The monsters had been us. This realization was not universal. Many Germans clung to the old narratives, insisting that they had been betrayed by weak leadership, that the camps were exaggerated Allied propaganda, that Germany had been the victim, not the aggressor. Denazification was incomplete and resentment lingered. But among those who accepted the truth, who confronted the photographs, the testimonies, the undeniable evidence of what had been done in their name, there was a profound reckoning. And in that reckoning, the rebuilt schools became symbols of a different kind of strength. Not the strength to dominate, but the strength to rebuild. Not the power to destroy, but the power to create. The schoolhouse in Bad Kreuznach, the one built in April 1945 by American soldiers, stood for 7 years. In 1952, it was finally replaced by a modern, permanent structure funded by the West German government. But before it was torn down, the town held a small ceremony. They invited the veterans of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers who had built it, though none could attend. They placed a plaque in the new building, commemorating the temporary school and the men who constructed it. The plaque is still there. It reads, in German and English, "In gratitude to those who built in the ruins." Today, the children of Bad Kreuznach attend school without thinking of bombs or rubble. They do not remember the fog of April 1945, or the old woman clutching a brick, or the soldiers unloading lumber in the shadow of destruction. That world is gone, but the legacy remains. It is embedded in the classrooms, in the textbooks, in the democratic institutions that govern their lives. It is the legacy of a choice made in the aftermath of catastrophe, a choice to rebuild rather than to punish, to educate. The German townspeople who watched the Americans build schools in the ruins of their cities could not believe it because it contradicted everything they had been taught. But in time, disbelief gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to transformation. Not overnight, not easily, but irreversibly. Because in the end, the most powerful weapon against hatred is not more hatred. It is not vengeance. It is not even justice, though justice is necessary. The most powerful weapon against hatred is the simple, stubborn act of building something better in its place. A bridge, a hospital, a classroom, a future. The Americans understood this. And in the spring of 1945, amid the rubble of a defeated nation, they proved it. With lumber and nails and sweat and mercy, they proved that even after the darkest chapter of human history, there is still room for a new beginning. That even among enemies there can be grace, that even in ruins something can grow. The old woman in Bad Kreuznach stood in the street, watching the school take shape. She did not speak, she did not pray, but she held that piece of brick a little less tightly, and when the sun set that evening she placed it gently on the ground, and she walked home. Somewhere